The whip cracked like a gunshot, slicing through the shimmering heat that rose from the hardpan desert outside Bitter Creek. Tobias Mac McCallum, a man who had made a career of minding his own business, reined in his weary gelding, pulling into the meager shade of a sandstone bluff. Below on the sun-scorched trail, the westbound stagecoach lay on its side like a wounded animal, its horses screaming in their tangled harnesses. 4 riders, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, swarmed the wreckage. They were professionals moving with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. One held a rifle on the terrified passengers huddled by the roadside, while the others tore through the luggage and strongbox. Mac's hand rested on the worn stock of the Winchester in his saddle scabbard, a gesture born of instinct, not intent. He was just a bystander, a ghost drifting through the ruins of his own life. The world and its troubles could burn for all he cared. He had no stake left in it. He was a tall man, 6'4" in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a world he'd long since shrugged off. 20 years of grief had carved deep lines around his pale blue eyes and leached the color from a beard that was now more salt than pepper. He watched the robbery unfold with a detached weariness, his face a stone mask. The crack of a pistol shot startled him from his stupor. One of the passengers, a man in a city suit, had made a foolish move. He now lay motionless in the red dust, a dark stain spreading across the back of his white shirt. The robbers, their work done, mounted up. They spurred their horses, kicking up a storm of dust as they galloped east, back toward the lawless sanctuary of Bitter Creek. As the last rider wheeled his horse, something small and dark fell from his saddlebag, landing softly in the dirt unnoticed. Mac waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the desert before he nudged his gelding forward. He had no interest in the dead man or the weeping passengers. He had his own ghosts to contend with. But as he passed the spot where the robber had dropped the object, a glint of polished wood caught his eye. He dismounted his joints, protesting, and bent to pick it up. It was a child's toy. A small, hand-carved wooden horse, its lines simple but full of life. The wood was worn smooth by small hands, and the dark stain of its coat rubbed away in places to reveal the pale pine beneath. He turned it over in his calloused palm. It was nothing, a piece of forgotten sentiment. But as his thumb traced the curve of the horse's neck, the world dissolved into a dizzying vortex of sensory memory. The scent of honeysuckle and fresh-baked bread. The feel of the sun warm and gentle on his face, not the punishing hammer it was now. A high, sweet laugh that echoed in a part of his soul he thought had died long ago. A small hand, warm and trusting, slipped into his own. He looked down into a pair of impossibly blue eyes, eyes that held the whole sky in their depths. Emma. She was 7, all knobby knees, and wild blonde curls, her face smudged with dirt from playing in the yard. "Look, Papa," she'd said, her voice bright with childish pride. She held up her own small carving, a clumsy but beloved wooden horse she'd named Thunder. "He's the fastest horse in the whole world." He remembered lifting her onto his shoulders, her small legs wrapped around his neck, her laughter a melody against the hum of a perfect summer afternoon. He remembered the feel of her weight, so light, so precious. It was the last perfect memory he had captured just moments before. The horses spooked before the wagon overturned, before the world ended in a splintering crash, and a silence that had screamed in his ears for 2 decades. The hand-carved horse fell from his trembling fingers, landing in the dust with a soft thud. Mac stumbled back, gasping for air, the desert sun suddenly unbearable. The flashback had been so vivid, so complete, it felt as though he had been ripped from one reality and thrust into another. The toy wasn't just a toy. It was a key one that had unlocked a door he had nailed shut and barricaded with 20 years of whiskey and regret. He stared at the wooden horse lying in the dust, a tiny, insignificant object, that had just torn his carefully constructed world apart. He didn't know who the rider was or how he'd come by such a thing. He only knew that out here in the vast and empty wasteland, a ghost from his past had just reached out and touched him. He picked the toy up again, his movements stiff, and slid it into his shirt pocket. The smooth wood felt warm against his chest, a strange and unwelcome comfort. He mounted his horse and turned not toward his ruined homestead, but toward the hazy collection of buildings shimmering in the distance, toward Bitter Creek. Red dust settled like a shroud over the clapboard buildings of Bitter Creek as Mac rode down its single sorry excuse for a main street. The sun beat down with the weight of a guilty conscience, bleaching the life from everything it touched. False-fronted buildings leaned against each other for support, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The town was a haven for men on the run, from the law, from their pasts, from themselves. Mac fit right in. He swung down from his gelding in front of the Broken Wheel Saloon, the hitching rail groaning under the horse's weight, and pushed through the batwing doors. The sudden coolness and gloom were a welcome relief. The saloon smelled of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unspoken sorrows. "Morning, Mac," a voice called from behind the bar. It was Ida Perkins, the saloon's owner, a woman whose 62 years were etched on her face in a roadmap of hard living and harder losses. She had a shotgun under the bar and a heart that was against all odds still capable of kindness. "You're early even for you." Mac grunted in response, settling onto his customary stool at the far end of the bar, a shadowed corner where a man could drink in peace. Ida slid a glass of whiskey toward him without being asked. The cheap stuff. It burned all the way down a familiar fire that momentarily scorched the ghosts away. He stared into the amber liquid, but instead of his own reflection, he saw the shimmering image of a 7-year-old girl with impossibly blue eyes. He blinked, and she was gone, replaced by the weary face of a 53-year-old man who looked 100. His hand went to his shirt pocket, his fingers brushing against the hard shape of the wooden horse. The memory it had summoned was still too raw, too close to the surface. He took a long swallow of whiskey, welcoming the burn. "You got that look again," Ida said, her voice soft, as she wiped down the bar with a damp rag. "The one that says you're wrestling with something bigger than a hangover." He didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the dusty window through which he could just make out the skeletal remains of his homestead 3 miles out of town. The 2-story ranch house, once his pride and joy, was now a monument to his failure. The wraparound porch where his wife Catherine used to sit shelling peas was gone, its timbers long since scavenged for firewood. The flower beds she had tended with such love were choked with weeds. The fever had taken Catherine a month after the accident, her grief a sickness that no doctor could cure. Mac had told everyone she'd died of a broken heart. The truth was, he suspected she had simply willed herself to die, unable to live in a world without their daughter. He'd let the ranch fall to ruin a physical manifestation of the emptiness inside him. Every broken board, every shattered window was a testament to the family he had failed to protect. His fingers found the small tarnished daguerreotype he always carried. The image was faded, but he knew every detail by heart: Catherine's gentle smile, Emma's gap-toothed grin, the rag doll named Sophie clutched in her small arms. He'd buried the doll with her, a small comfort in the face of an unbearable loss. The saloon door creaked open, letting in a shaft of blinding sunlight, and Jeremiah Pike, the town's blacksmith. Pike was a man built like his own anvil, solid and dependable, but his eyes were nervous as he settled onto a stool 2 down from Mac. He nodded a silent greeting, his gaze darting around the empty saloon as if he expected trouble. "Some excitement planned for today," I hear Pike said, his voice a low rumble. He spoke to Ida, but his eyes flickered toward Mac. "What kind of excitement?" Ida asked, her tone casual, but her hands stilled their polishing. She knew every undercurrent in Bitter Creek, every whispered rumor. Pike took a long pull from the beer Ida set before him. "Just talk," he said, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He wiped foam from his mustache with the back of a soot-stained hand. You know how stories get twisted around here. Old Miguel's been spreading tales about the stockyard. Mac's head came up. The stockyard sat at the edge of town, a place of dust, sweat, and the smell of fear. It was run by men who answered to Sheriff Vance Murdoch, a man whose brand of peace was paid for in bribes and blind eyes. Miguel Santos ran the trading post on the edge of town, a quiet man who had survived by seeing nothing and saying less. If Miguel was talking, something was deeply wrong. What kind of talk? Mac found himself asking, the words rough from disuse. He hated the curiosity that pricked at him, an old instinct he thought he'd long since drowned. Pike shifted on his stool, his discomfort palpable. He looked over his shoulder toward the empty doorway. Probably nothing. Just unusual activity. Wagons coming and going at all hours. Men he don't recognize. The blacksmith lowered his voice, leaning closer. He says he heard children crying. The word struck Mac with the force of a physical blow. Children crying. The air in the saloon suddenly felt thick, heavy. His hand tightened on his whiskey glass, the knuckles turning white. For a moment he was back in the ravine, the overturned wagon, the terrible silence where Emma's cries should have been. Children don't belong at a livestock auction. Ida said, her voice sharp, cutting through the thick tension. Her gaze was fixed on Pike, demanding the truth. No, Pike agreed, his voice barely a whisper. They don't. The three of them sat in a heavy silence. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Mac knew what he should do. Finish his drink, walk out the door, and ride back to his ruin of a home. Get drunk. Forget. It was the routine that had kept him numb for 20 years. Getting involved was a fool's game, a sure path to a pain he couldn't bear to feel again. But the image of that wooden horse, followed by the specter of crying children in a cattle pen, had lit a small defiant flicker in the darkness of his soul. It was the dying ember of a conscience he thought long dead. I should get going, Pike said, his voice strained. He tossed a few coins on the bar and hurried out, leaving the silence behind him. Ida began to rearrange bottles on the back bar, her movements precise and deliberate. Mac, she said, her back still to him. You ever think about fixing that place up? She nodded toward the window, but he knew she wasn't talking about the house anymore. No point, he rasped. Nothing left to fix it for, isn't there? She asked, turning to face him. Her eyes, which had seen every kind of sorrow, held a challenge. Or are you just afraid to try? He finished his whiskey in one gulp, the liquid fire doing nothing to warm the ice in his chest. He stood his tall frame, casting a long shadow in the dim light. He felt the weight of the wooden horse in his pocket, a small, hard accusation. As he walked toward the door, Ida's words followed him. Outside, the heat hit him like a furnace blast. He found himself looking not toward his homestead, but toward the eastern edge of town, where a plume of dust rose from the direction of the old stockyard. He told himself to go home. He told himself it wasn't his fight. But his feet, guided by a force he no longer understood, began to carry him down the dusty street toward the sound of children crying. The stockyard reeked of manure, fear, and something else Mac couldn't immediately name: greed. It was a thick, cloying smell, like meat left too long in the sun. He moved along the high wooden fence, keeping to the shadows, the sounds from within growing clearer. The low murmur of men's voices, the nervous shuffling of feet, and woven through it all the thin, heartbreaking sound of a child's sob. He found a gap in the weathered planks and peered through. What he saw turned the simmering disquiet in his gut into a cold, hard knot of rage. The main pen, usually filled with bellowing longhorns, was crowded with children. A dozen or more, ranging from toddlers to young teens, huddled together like frightened sheep. Their faces were streaked with dirt and tears, their clothes torn and filthy. On a makeshift platform overlooking the pen stood Sheriff Vance Murdoch, his ample belly straining the buttons of his vest, his silver badge gleaming with sickening irony. Murdoch was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, a predator who wore the guise of a lawman. "Gentlemen, gentlemen." Murdoch's voice boomed rich and oily. "We have some fine specimens for your consideration today, young, healthy, and easily trained to your particular needs." He gestured to the pen with a theatrical flourish, his tone no different than a rancher selling prize heifers. "And I can personally guarantee their previous owners won't be coming to look for them." A ripple of appreciative laughter went through the crowd of buyers. They were well-dressed men, their suits and hats out of place in the dusty stockyard. Their hands were soft, their faces pale. They looked at the children not with pity, but with the cold, calculating gaze of connoisseurs inspecting merchandise. Mac felt bile rise in his throat. This wasn't just a back-alley deal. It was an organized marketplace for human souls. "Let's start with this one," Murdoch announced. Two of his deputies, brutish men with vacant eyes, waded into the pen and dragged out a small girl no older than 10. She fought her small fists, flailing, but they handled her with rough indifference, hauling her onto the platform. Lot number 7. A fine girl, good teeth, strong back. Perfect for household duties. "Who'll start the bidding at $50? Hands shot up. The bidding was brisk, impersonal. The girl stood trembling, a piece of property being appraised and sold. Mac watched his breath catching in his chest, his knuckles white where he gripped the fence. Every sob from the pen was a nail being driven into his heart. Then he saw her. She was tucked away in a corner of the pen, as small and fragile as a desert wildflower. She couldn't have been more than 5, with a tangle of blonde hair that shone like spun gold in the harsh sunlight. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, clutching a tattered rag doll. But it was her eyes that shattered Mac's world for the second time that day. They were impossibly blue. Emma's eyes. The resemblance was so stark, so absolute, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. It was as if the ghost from his memories had taken on flesh and blood and was sitting in that filthy pen, waiting to be sold. His grief, a dull ache he had carried for 20 years, erupted into a white-hot cleansing rage. "And now for our prize," Murdoch's voice slicked across the yard. "Lot number 12. A real beauty. Look at that hair, gentlemen. Those eyes. This one will fetch a premium in the right market." The two deputies started toward the little girl. She pressed herself against the fence, her small body trembling, clutching her doll tighter. When they reached for her, she let out a high, terrified wail, a sound that sliced through Mac's soul and tore away the last of his restraint. Leave her alone. The roar that ripped from his throat was not the voice of a man, but of an animal, a sound of pure primal fury born of 2 decades of repressed anguish. Every head in the stockyard snapped in his direction. He was already moving, vaulting the fence with an agility that belied his size and age. The deputies froze their hands, hovering over the child, their faces slack with shock as 6'4" of vengeful wrath bore down on them. The first deputy went down with a sickening crack as Mac's fist connected with his jaw. The second fumbled for his pistol, but Mac was faster. He grabbed the man by the collar, lifting him clear off the ground, his face inches from the deputies. "Draw on me, boy." Mac's voice was now a deadly whisper, more terrifying than his roar. "But you better not miss." The deputy's gun clattered to the dirt. Chaos erupted. Buyers scattered like quail. Murdoch's other men drew their weapons, their surprise turning to anger. "Kill him!" Murdoch screamed from his platform, his face purple with rage. "Kill that crazy old fool." Mac dropped the deputy and spun toward the pen, his focus singular. He scooped up the little girl with one arm, pulling her tight against his chest. She was feather light, her small arms wrapped around his neck in a desperate grip. She smelled of dust and fear. Gunfire exploded around them. Bullets splintered the fence posts, whining past their ears. Mac used his own body as a shield, running a broken field pattern toward the stockyard gate where his horse was tethered. "Stop shooting, you idiots," Murdoch bellowed. "You'll hit the merchandise." The word merchandise fueled Mac's rage into a pure killing fire. He reached his gelding, swinging into the saddle with the child still clutched in his arm. He kicked the horse into a gallop, bursting through the flimsy gate and out onto the open desert. Behind them, shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats signaled the pursuit had begun. As they fled, the little girl looked up at him, her tear-filled blue eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. Her mouth formed a single soundless word he could have sworn was "Papa." Or maybe after 20 years of silence, he was just finally hearing what his broken heart needed to hear. He spurred the horse harder, pushing it toward the unforgiving wilderness. He had no plan, no destination. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, he was not running from his past, but toward a future he had to protect. The desert became their sanctuary, a vast sun-blasted canvas of rock and sand. For 3 hours, Mac pushed the old gelding, riding south into the labyrinthine canyons he had explored during years of solitary, grief-stricken wandering. He knew the hidden springs, the sheltered caves, the trails that could lose a pursuing posse in a maze of red rock. He finally reined the horse to a halt in the deep shadow of an overhanging cliff, the entrance to a cave system masked by a thicket of creosote and prickly pear. The gelding's flanks were lathered its breath, coming in ragged gasps, but they had bought themselves time. The dust cloud of Murdoch's men was a faint smudge on the northern horizon. Inside the cave, the air was cool and still. Mac dismounted carefully, his arm still protectively wrapped around the small girl. He set her down on a flat, sun-warmed boulder. She immediately curled into a tight ball, her face buried against her tattered rag doll, her small body trembling from shock and exhaustion. He finally had a chance to truly look at her. She was desperately thin, the bones of her wrists and face sharp beneath her smudged skin. There were angry red rope burns on her wrists, and as she shifted, he saw an ugly circular scar on the back of her left hand and the unmistakable mark of a branding iron. Someone had marked her like cattle. The sight sent a fresh wave of cold fury through him, so intense it made him dizzy. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She didn't respond, only flinched when he moved toward her with his canteen. He stopped, setting the water on the ground between them. "It's all right," he said gently. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." The words felt hollow, a promise from a man who had broken every important one he'd ever made. He needed to connect with her to show her he wasn't one of them. He pulled the old brass compass from his father's pocket. "See this," he said, holding it out. "It always points the way home, no matter how lost you get." Her eyes, Emma's eyes, fixed on the swinging needle. "My name's Tobias. Most folks call me Mac. What's your name, sweetheart?" Silence stretched thick and heavy. Just when he thought she wouldn't answer, a tiny, almost inaudible sound escaped her lips. What was that? "Juniper," she whispered the name, as fragile as she was. "Juniper. That's a pretty name." The thought struck him that they needed help, real help. There was only one person in Bitter Creek he might trust. There's a man, he thought aloud, a doctor. Elijah Brennan. He's not like the others. Dr. Brennan was a town fixture, a man who had appeared 15 years ago with a medical bag and a past he never spoke of. He treated everyone regardless of station or color and had a quiet disdain for Sheriff Murdoch that he made no effort to hide. Brennan lived and worked in the Mexican Quarter, a part of town Murdoch's authority barely touched. "Can you ride a little longer, Juniper?" he asked. "I know someone who can help us." She gave a small, solemn nod, the simple trust in the gesture, a knife in his gut. He lifted her back onto the horse, and they rode circling wide around Bitter Creek, under the cover of the approaching dusk. Brennan's clinic was a small adobe building at the end of a dusty street. The door opened before he could knock. Dr. Elijah Brennan stood there, a man nearing 70 with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by the sight of a grizzled cowboy holding a traumatized child. Inside, Brennan set his voice a low command. Quickly. The clinic was clean and smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Brennan led them to a back room where a woman with grief and rage etched into her dark eyes was grinding herbs in a mortar. Maria, Brennan said. "This is Mac McCallum. I believe he's brought us one of the lost ones." The woman, Maria Santos, approached Juniper with a quiet reverence. "Mi niña," she whispered. It was only then that Mac made the connection. Miguel Santos, the trader who'd started the rumors. This must be his wife. She escaped, Maria said, her voice fierce. "I took her," Mac corrected. "From the auction. She reminded me of my Emma." An understanding passed between the three adults. "They will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." Maria stated a fact, not a warning. "Murdoch cannot afford to let this stand. Let them come." Mac said, his gaze fixed on Juniper. As Brennan began to gently examine the girl, his professional calm shattered when he saw the brand on her hand. "Branding iron," he said, his voice tight with fury. "They marked her. There are others," Maria said, her eyes burning. "Other families. We have been keeping a record." She gestured to a locked cabinet. "We have waited for someone to make the first move." Suddenly, Mac was no longer just a man on the run. He was the center of a nascent resistance. Brennan unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a thick ledger. He opened it, revealing pages filled with names, ages, and dates of disappearance. "We've been documenting Murdoch's crimes for years," Brennan explained. "We are not the only ones who have lost children in this town. We just lacked the spark to light the fire." He looked at Mac. "I think you just brought us a thunderbolt." It was in that moment that Mac's flight from the law transformed into an investigation. Brennan introduced him to others who gathered at the clinic under the cover of darkness. Ruth Calhoun, a steely-eyed rancher whose grandson had vanished 2 years prior. Tom Bradshaw, a young cowboy whose daughter was taken on her way to school. Each story was a fresh wound, a testament to the evil that had taken root in Bitter Creek. Among them was an old prospector, Silas Croft, a man who had lived in the hills surrounding the town his entire life. As the group shared what they knew, Silas spoke up. "That Murdoch family. They've always had a black heart. I remember a feud must be 40 years ago now, between old man Murdoch and your father Mac, over the deed to the Black Creek pasture land, a bitter thing. Your pa won out in the end, but the Murdochs never forgive a slight. Never." The piece of information seemed random, a historical footnote. But it planted a seed of unease in Mac's mind. Murdoch's interest in him, his pursuit, felt personal. More than just anger over a disrupted sale. It felt like a vendetta. Their new mission was clear, and they needed hard evidence, something irrefutable they could take to the territorial authorities. The answer lay with the man who legitimized Murdoch's every action. Judge Bartholomew Finch. Maria, who sometimes did cleaning for the judge's wife, knew of a private office behind the main house where Finch conducted his real business. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. 2 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon, Mac and Tom Bradshaw crept through the manicured gardens of Judge Finch's estate, while Maria created a diversion at the front of the house. The office was unlocked. Inside, filing cabinets lined one wall. They found what they were looking for in a heavy leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a floorboard. As Mac held a lantern over the yellowed pages, his world collapsed for the third and most devastating time. The entries detailed a history of transactions, names of children matched with prices and buyers. His hands shaking, he flipped back through the years until he found a date that was seared into his memory. June 15th, 1856. The entry was chillingly concise. One girl, age 7, blonde hair, blue eyes. Taken from wagon accident site, Desert Springs Canyon. Sold to private collector, San Francisco. Price $200. Recovery not expected. Below it, a note was added in the same hand. Subject identified as Emma Catherine McCallum. Mother Catherine deceased in subsequent recovery attempt. Father Tobias informed child died in accident. The ledger slipped from his numb fingers. It was all a lie. The accident, Emma's death, Catherine's fever. Emma had been stolen, sold, and Catherine hadn't died of a broken heart. She had been murdered. Murdered while trying to find their daughter. The grief that had defined him for 20 years was not the result of a tragic accident, but of a calculated, monstrous crime. But it was the next discovery on the facing page that provided the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. Tucked into the ledger was a loose sheet of paper, a note written in a younger, more flamboyant hand, Sheriff Murdoch's. It was dated just after the entry for Emma. It read, "A McCallum for a McCallum. The debt is beginning to be paid." Silas Croft's words about the old land dispute echoed in his mind. This was never just about money. This was revenge. A multi-generational vendetta passed from father to son. Murdoch wasn't just a trafficker. He was an architect of suffering, systematically destroying Mac's family to settle a 40-year-old score. His mission was no longer about saving an orphan. It was about avenging his wife, reclaiming his daughter, and destroying the man who had stolen his entire world. The broken man was gone, burned away in the fire of this revelation. In his place stood a father, a husband, and an instrument of pure, cold, burning retribution. Their hideout, an abandoned silver mine deep in the hills, had become the nerve center of the resistance. The ledger from Judge Finch's office was their holy text, its damning pages laid bare for all to see. The revelation of Mac's personal history with Murdoch galvanized the group. His fight was now their fight. But as they planned their next move, a scout Joseph Standing Bear had posted on the ridge came scrambling down his face, pale. "Riders," he gasped. "A dozen of them, headed this way." "It's Murdoch." They had been found. A frantic scramble ensued as they prepared for a siege, barricading the mine entrance with ore carts and loose rock. Mac positioned his small force of ranchers and townsfolk at strategic points within the tunnels, his mind a cold, clear instrument of tactical calculation. This was no longer a desperate flight. It was a battle. The attack came without warning, a volley of rifle fire peppering the mine entrance. Murdoch's men were professionals, fanning out to cover all angles, trying to pin them down. The fight was brutal and close quarters. The air in the mine filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of ricocheting bullets. But Mac's group had the advantage of terrain and desperation. They held their ground, exacting a heavy toll on the attackers. After an hour of intense fighting, a tense silence fell. A voice echoed from outside the barricade. It was Murdoch. "McCallum, give it up, you're outnumbered. Send out the girl and I'll let the rest of your pathetic friends live." "Go to hell," Murdoch, Mac roared back. A chilling laugh echoed through the canyon. "Oh, I've been there, McCallum. It's where your daughter has been living for the last 20 years. But you don't even know the half of it, do you?" Murdoch appeared at the mine entrance, holding a white flag in one hand and his pistol in the other. He stepped forward, his face a mask of smug cruelty. "You think you're saving some poor orphan you stumbled upon, you self-righteous fool." He paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. Mac felt a cold dread creep up his spine. "That little girl," Murdoch said, his voice dripping with venom, "is your own blood. Your precious Emma grew up. She was very resilient, very valuable. She grew up to give me more merchandise to sell. I've been selling your legacy for years, McCallum. That little girl you call Juniper, she's your granddaughter. The word struck Mac with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, the rifle in his hands, suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He looked over at Juniper, who was huddled behind a stack of crates with Maria. Her face, her eyes, the stubborn set of her chin, it was all there. The resemblance he'd seen, the connection, he'd felt it was real. This child, this brave, broken little girl, was his granddaughter. Emma was alive and had a child of her own. The joy of that realization was instantly poisoned by the horror of its context. Murdoch hadn't just stolen his daughter. He had enslaved her, used her, and sold her children. He had been profiting from the destruction of the McCallum line, one generation at a time. The psychological blow was exactly what Murdoch had intended. It was designed to shatter him, to break his will. But as Murdoch's cruel laughter echoed in the mine, something inside Mac solidified. The grief, the rage, the shock, it all coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. He was no longer just a man seeking vengeance. He was a grandfather, fighting for his family's future. "You think this breaks me?" Murdoch Mac's voice was dangerously quiet. "You just gave me the one thing I haven't had in 20 years. A reason to live." With a roar, he pushed aside the barricade and charged. The battle for the mine was over. The war for his family's soul had just begun. The final confrontation was set for the one place in Bitter Creek that should have been a sanctuary, the old mission church on the outskirts of town. Murdoch, after his retreat from the mine, had consolidated his forces there, turning the house of God into a fortress for his profane enterprise. He planned one final massive auction before disappearing with his profits, and his most valuable prisoners, including Mac, now knew with terrifying certainty his daughter Emma. As Mac and his small band of fighters approached under the cover of a roiling blood-red sunset, the sky itself seemed to mirror the coming violence. A fierce sandstorm was gathering on the western horizon, a churning wall of dust and wind that was bearing down on them. The storm was a ticking clock. It would reduce visibility, create chaos, and give them the cover they needed. But it also threatened to cut off any chance of escape. They established their positions on the ridges surrounding the church. The plan was desperate, a frontal assault on a superior force. But they had no other choice. Inside that church were 24 stolen children, Mac's daughter, and the last chance for justice in a town that had forgotten the word. The assault began with a storm. As the first gale-force winds hit the church, whipping sand into a blinding frenzy, Mac gave the signal. The attack was a blur of controlled chaos. Ruth Calhoun and Joseph Standing Bear laid down withering, suppressing fire from the east, their rifles picking off the guards on the church roof. Tom Bradshaw, his wounded leg tightly bound, created a diversion at the main gate with a volley of shots that drew the attention of half the gunmen. Under this cover, Mac, Dr. Brennan, and Maria breached a side entrance, slipping into the church's narthex like vengeful spirits. The scene inside was a nightmare. The pews were filled not with worshippers, but with wealthy stone-faced buyers. On the altar, transformed into an auction block, stood Sheriff Murdoch, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of desperate greed. Cages lined the sanctuary, filled with the terrified faces of children. And standing beside Murdoch, her expression a mixture of defiance and despair, was a grown woman with blonde hair and Emma's eyes. Murdoch was in the middle of auctioning off a young boy when Mac's group burst in. "This ends now," Mac bellowed, his voice carrying over the howl of the storm. Panic erupted. Buyers dove for cover. Murdoch's gunmen opened fire. The church became a maelstrom of splintering wood, flying lead and screaming children. Mac moved with a singular purpose. His Winchester a seamless extension of his will, his shots precise and deadly. He fought his way toward the altar, toward his daughter. He finally cornered Murdoch in the sacristy, the two men facing each other amidst robes and religious icons. The storm raged outside, casting eerie dancing shadows through the stained glass windows. "It's over, Murdoch," Mac set his rifle steady. Murdoch laughed a ragged, broken sound. "Over? It's never over for men like you and me, McCallum. This is our legacy." He gestured vaguely toward the chaos in the sanctuary. "But you've made a tactical error. You came for your daughter, but she isn't here." Mac froze. "What are you talking about? I saw her." "You saw a woman who looks like her." Murdoch sneered. "A decoy. I'm not that stupid. Your real daughter, Emma, she's miles from here, in a place only I know about. And if you kill me, you'll never see her again." It was a devastating blow, a moral dilemma of impossible weight. Kill the monster who had destroyed his life and get his revenge, or spare him for the slimmest chance of saving his daughter. Murdoch saw the indecision in his eyes and pressed his advantage. "Let me walk out of here, McCallum, and I'll give you her location. A fair trade. Your revenge for her life." Mac's world narrowed to the space between them, the choice tearing him apart. But then a new sound cut through the storm, the sound of organized chaos from the sanctuary. The decoy on the altar was not a decoy after all. It was Emma, and she was not a helpless victim. In the confusion, she had organized the other children. At her signal, they had created a diversion, throwing hymnals, knocking over candelabras, and swarming the remaining guards with the furious energy of the long oppressed. The diversion was all Mac needed. As Murdoch's head turned for a split second, Mac struck his rifle butt, connecting with the sheriff's temple. Murdoch crumpled to the floor, subdued but alive. The children were safe. The buyers were captured. And now the final urgent goal was clear: find Emma. With Murdoch bound and gagged in the back of a wagon, the journey to find Emma was a tense, silent procession through the dying throes of the sandstorm. The disgraced sheriff, his arrogance shattered, finally led them to a small, isolated cabin tucked away in a remote canyon, a place where he kept his most valuable assets. When Mac pushed open the door, he found a young woman sitting at a simple wooden table mending a child's dress. She looked up, and for a heart-stopping moment, 20 years fell away. She had Catherine's gentle eyes and his own stubborn chin. Her face was lined with a weariness far beyond her 27 years, but her spirit, the one he remembered from a 7-year-old girl who loved wooden horses, was still there, burning quietly but fiercely. "Papa," she whispered the word, a question, a memory, a hope. The reunion was not one of dramatic embraces, but of quiet, hesitant touches and words left unspoken. It was a meeting of two strangers bound by blood and a shared trauma, feeling their way back to each other across 2 decades of pain. Juniper, holding tight to Mac's hand, approached her mother slowly, a bridge between the broken past and a possible future. The sight of her daughter whole and safe was what finally broke Emma's composure. And the three of them, daughter, father, granddaughter, clung to each other as the first rays of dawn broke over the canyon. Their return to Bitter Creek was met by the sight of federal marshals summoned by Dr. Brennan's urgent message taking control of the town. Murdoch, his buyers, Judge Finch, and the rest of the trafficking network were taken into custody. Their empire of cruelty dismantled piece by piece. The rescued children were cared for at the now liberated church, and a slow, painful process of reuniting them with their families began. Dr. Brennan, with the marshal's support, began the arduous task of building a new, honest town leadership from the ashes of the old. The reign of darkness over Bitter Creek was finally over. 6 months later, the McCallum homestead was reborn. The skeletal ruin had been transformed into a sprawling, welcoming ranch house, its fresh white paint gleaming in the desert sun. New fences enclosed pastures where horses grazed peacefully, and Catherine's flower garden bloomed with a riot of color. It was no longer a monument to loss, but a sanctuary of hope, serving as a home for Emma Juniper and the handful of rescued children who had nowhere else to go. The sound of children's laughter, once a painful echo of the past, was now the lifeblood of the house. On a warm evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Mac stood on the newly finished porch with Emma and Juniper. The air was calm, the world at peace. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the faded daguerreotype of Catherine and a 7-year-old Emma, the ghost he had carried for 20 years. He looked at it one last time, his thumb gently stroking Catherine's smiling face. Then he walked over to a small wooden box on a porch table. Inside lay his father's old compass, the tarnished brass symbol of his years of wandering aimlessly through grief. He carefully placed the daguerreotype beside it, the image of his past grief and the tool of his wandering together at last. He closed the lid with a soft, final click. He had finally found his way home. He returned to the railing, putting one arm around his daughter and the other around his granddaughter. The three of them stood together, 3 generations of McCallums, their silhouettes framed against the setting sun, watching over a land that was for the first time in decades truly theirs.